People often think religion began with deep questions about life and death. But if you step back and look at how religion actually spread and worked in history, something else becomes obvious. It wasn't just about belief, it was about control. Religions didn't rise in isolation, like harmless ideas growing in a quiet garden. They were shaped, sharpened, and spread by men in charge: rulers, priests, landowners, warlords, people who had something to gain. And the more you study history, the more it becomes clear. These belief systems weren't just spiritual tools, they were political tools. When societies became too big to manage by direct force, they needed something stronger than weapons, something that could live inside the minds of people and shape how they saw themselves, each other, and the world. That's where religion became useful. If people could be taught that a god had already chosen their ruler, or that suffering in this life would lead to rewards in another, then you could build an empire without constant violence. You could control thousands with words instead of whips. The earliest kings in Mesopotamia didn't just want obedience, they wanted loyalty. And the way to get loyalty was to claim they were chosen by the gods. The Egyptian pharaohs didn't just govern, they were said to be divine. That meant disobedience wasn't just treason, it was blasphemy. This pattern shows up everywhere, again and again. Men in power turning religion into a tool to stay in power. Even the structure of early religious institutions reveals this. Look at the priesthoods. They were usually closed groups, run by men, trained in rituals, in languages common people didn't understand. That gave them an edge. If only the priest could read the sacred texts, then only he could say what the gods wanted. This created a dependence. People had to rely on religious leaders not just for spiritual guidance, but for basic decisions about right and wrong, life and death. Religion and authority were never far apart. In ancient Rome, the emperor became a god after death, and eventually during his life too. That wasn't about faith, that was about solidifying power. If the ruler was divine, then questioning him wasn't just disloyal, it was dangerous to the whole world order. The same pattern played out in China, with the mandate of heaven. As long as an emperor ruled well, he had the mandate. If there was famine or rebellion, it meant the heavens had withdrawn their blessing. That belief gave religious cover to political shifts, but always within the system, never outside it. Religion stayed tied to the throne. You can even see this in how laws were created. Religious law was often the first legal system. The Ten Commandments, the Code of Hammurabi, Islamic Sharia, all gave moral weight to legal rules. But those rules weren't just about ethics. They were also about property, taxes, land, power. Many religious laws protected elites and punished the poor more harshly. They set rules about women, inheritance, speech, and status. In short, religion gave a sacred face to systems that helped powerful men stay powerful. And it wasn't just ancient history. Look at the Middle Ages. The church wasn't just a spiritual force, it was a political empire. Popes had armies, they made alliances with kings, they crowned emperors, and they excommunicated anyone who got in their way. That's not just religion, that's power dressed as holiness. When you read about the Crusades, what stands out isn't just religious zeal, it's land grabs, political rivalries, and control over trade routes. Religion provided the excuse, but power was the real prize. Even the Inquisition, which tortured people in the name of purity, was a tool to eliminate threats to the church's control. It wasn't about truth, it was about obedience. In every generation, religion adapted to the needs of those in charge. When monarchs needed loyalty, religion taught that kings ruled by divine right. When colonial powers wanted to conquer new lands, missionaries went in first. They baptized the locals, taught obedience, and paved the way for control. Colonization wasn't just military, it was spiritual warfare, and religion was the first weapon drawn. Look at the Americas. Native people were told their gods were false, their cultures sinful. Churches were built on sacred sites, often by force. Conversion wasn't just about belief. It was about breaking identity and replacing it with loyalty to a new system. You weren't just saved, you were subdued. Even today, political leaders often wrap themselves in religious language. In many countries, laws are still based on scriptures, and questioning those laws is seen not just as dissent, but as immorality. That's how deeply power and religion remain linked. When you say, "This law comes from God," there's no room for debate. You shut down discussion before it starts. That's not a search for truth, that's a tactic. Many religious leaders throughout history were wealthy landowners, politicians in robes. They lived in palaces, controlled wealth, and made decisions about other people's lives. When peasants starved, they were told to pray. When they asked why the rich kept getting richer, they were told that questioning the divine order was dangerous. This wasn't faith, it was fear, shaped and maintained by those at the top. You'll notice how often religions ask followers to obey, not just the divine, but those who claim to speak for the divine. That's the trick. It creates a hierarchy. God at the top, then the leaders, then everyone else. And if you challenge the leaders, you're told you're challenging God. That's not spirituality. That's manipulation. Some will say, but religion helps people. And sometimes it does. It brings comfort, meaning, community. But that doesn't erase the way it's been used. Just because something can do good doesn't mean it hasn't also done harm. We don't judge systems only by their best outcomes. We also look at their history. And the history of religion is packed with violence, coercion, and political games. Even reform movements within religion often get crushed by the very institutions that claim to represent peace. Think of the thinkers who were silenced, the scientists who were punished, the rebels who were burned. Their crime wasn't always heresy. Sometimes it was simply asking the wrong questions, questions that threatened power. And again, that's the pattern. Religion has often reacted harshly to change, not because truth was in danger, but because power was. And when belief systems are used to defend control, they stop being about truth altogether. They become barriers to thought. It's important to notice how religion teaches people to submit, not just spiritually, but socially. Don't question. Don't doubt. Have faith. Those are useful messages if you are the one in charge. You don't want people asking too many questions. You want them to accept the order as it is, because that order benefits you. And that's the real issue here. Religion, as it has been shaped and used, often serves those who already hold power. It gives them moral cover, political leverage, and social obedience. It's not just about gods, it's about systems. We're told that morality comes from religion, but many of the most oppressive rules were written to protect privilege, not justice. Rules about women's roles, about sex, about who can speak and who must stay silent. They weren't written by a god. They were written by men with something to lose, and they disguised their fear of change as divine wisdom. Even the afterlife plays a role in this. If you can convince people that rewards or punishments will come after death, then they're easier to control in this life. If someone is poor, tell them they'll be rich in heaven. If someone is suffering, tell them it's a test. That way, you don't need to fix the system. You just need them to accept it. This idea of eternal judgment also creates fear, and fear keeps people in line. It's hard to challenge authority when you think your soul is at stake. That's not just belief, that's psychological control. Even religions that claim to preach love often maintain strict hierarchies, and those hierarchies are rarely built on kindness. They're built on obedience, silence, and guilt. That's not an accident, that's design. And the deeper you go, the more obvious it becomes. Religions didn't just happen, they were shaped, carefully, deliberately, by the needs of the powerful. They weren't pure expressions of human wonder. They were tools that told people who they were, where they belonged, and who they had to obey. They gave people a story, and the story always ended with someone at the top, untouched, unquestioned, and usually male. That wasn't a coincidence. It was the system protecting itself. When people started reading on their own, interpreting on their own, challenging the old voices, that system got nervous, because once you remove the need for a gatekeeper, the gatekeepers lose their control. Religious texts weren't just preserved, they were edited, selected, censored. Books were left out, ideas were rewritten, whole theologies were shaped by councils, not revelations. Look into how the Bible was formed, or how the Quran was compiled, or how Hindu scriptures were passed through priestly castes. These weren't just spiritual moments, they were political ones. Decisions were made not just about what was true, but about what was useful, what was dangerous, what would preserve order. And what about those who tried to offer a different message? They were often silenced, branded as heretics, rebels, apostates. Why? Not because their ideas lacked merit, but because they posed a threat to the power structure. Throughout history, voices calling for equality, reason, or reform were often treated as enemies of faith, when in truth, they were enemies of control. Some argue that without religion, society would fall apart. But look around. Many secular societies have lower crime, higher education, better gender equality, and stronger healthcare than deeply religious ones. That's not a fluke. When power isn't concentrated in religious authority, there's more room for fairness and progress. Belief in a God doesn't guarantee morality, but freedom from religious rule can make morality more flexible, more compassionate, and more just. And let's be clear, this isn't about attacking spirituality. People will always ask big questions. They'll search for meaning, for connection, for something beyond themselves. That's human. But what we're talking about here isn't that natural search. We're talking about how that search has been hijacked, how systems of belief were taken over, shaped, and repackaged, not to elevate people, but to control them. Take the concept of guilt. Many religions use guilt not as a path to self-awareness, but as a tool of obedience. You sin, you confess, you obey. That cycle keeps you small. It keeps you looking up, not around. It keeps you focused on personal purity instead of social justice, and that helps the ones in charge. Now look at the role of women in most traditional religions. They're often told to be silent, to serve, to submit. That's not divine wisdom. That's patriarchy dressed in robes. When you examine the actual power structures of these religions, women are almost always excluded from leadership. Why? Because letting women speak, lead, or question would break the hierarchy that religion helped create. Religions that promote caste systems, racial superiority, or divine kingship are not accidental distortions. They're reflections of who held the pen when the rules were written. If your religion tells you that your suffering is your fault, or that the rich deserve their wealth, or that leaders must be obeyed no matter what, they're not offering wisdom. They're offering submission. And submission, when praised as a virtue, becomes a quiet cage. Even today, some governments fund religious institutions because they know it keeps people quiet. Teach them to follow, not to question. Teach them that obedience is sacred, even when their rights are being taken. Teach them to forgive their oppressors instead of holding them accountable. That isn't moral instruction, that's political strategy. Look at how religious influence shows up in laws about marriage, sexuality, education, even science. In many places, policies that should be based on reason, evidence, or compassion are instead shaped by ancient texts and clerical interpretations. That's not wisdom leading society, it's history holding it back. And then there's the way religion deals with doubt. In science, doubt is encouraged. In philosophy, it's essential. But in religion, doubt is often condemned. Why? Because doubt is dangerous to power. A person who doubts can't be easily controlled. They ask questions. They don't settle for fear-based answers. And when enough people doubt, the system starts to crack. That's why blasphemy is still a crime in many parts of the world. Not because gods are offended, but because leaders are. Blasphemy laws protect power, not divinity. They silence people not to preserve truth, but to prevent disruption. And yet, truth doesn't need protection. Power does. Look at how many wars have been fought in the name of religion. Crusades, jihads, forced conversions, massacres, inquisitions. These weren't just spiritual disagreements. They were battles for land, influence, and legacy. Religion gave those wars moral cover. It made conquest feel holy. It made violence seem necessary. It made cruelty look righteous. In every era, religion has followed power like a shadow. When the powerful moved, religion moved too. When slavery was profitable, religion justified it. When apartheid needed defending, religion blessed it. When women demanded rights, religion told them to wait. And when people began to break free, religion suddenly became very concerned with order and tradition. But order for who? Tradition for what? There's a reason so many religious leaders are uncomfortable with change. Change threatens the systems they rely on. If people stop believing that they must be ruled, that they must stay in their place, that they must accept suffering as part of a plan, then the old structures start to shake, and the voices at the top grow desperate. Even within religions, the most radical voices have often come from below. Reformers, rebels, mystics, people who spoke directly to the divine without going through the approved channels. And what happened to them? Often they were cast out, killed, or erased from history. Because they didn't just question doctrine, they questioned control. And that's the thread that runs through all of this. control, religion, especially as it has been institutionalized, politicized, and weaponized, has never just been about belief. It's been about power. Who has it? Who keeps it? Who benefits from your silence? Some people say religion is above politics, but in truth, religion has always been part of politics, not separate from power, but embedded in it. It helped create hierarchies, justify conquest, and suppress rebellion. It told people their place and called it sacred. And when people stepped out of line, it punished them, not just in this life, but in the next. That's not a spiritual path. That's a control mechanism. So, when we look at religion today, we can't just ask, what do people believe? We have to ask, who benefits from those beliefs? Who gains when people are told to submit? Who gains when questioning is forbidden? Who gains when guilt replaces action and obedience replaces thought? Because belief on its own is not dangerous. But belief that has been shaped by the powerful to serve their needs, that's where the danger lies. The more you trace the history, the clearer the pattern becomes. Religion was never just about the gods. It was about those who claimed to speak for them, and those people weren't sages in caves or monks on mountaintops. More often, they were kings, generals, lawmakers, and landowners, men who stood to gain the most from loyalty without question and obedience without resistance. Think about how religious stories are often framed. The hero is someone who obeys without hesitation. The villain is the one who doubts or disobeys. The message is repeated over and over. Don't challenge, don't question, don't step outside the lines. And if you do, there's punishment, not just now, but forever. That kind of messaging doesn't just shape behavior, it shapes identity. It teaches people to tie their worth to compliance. It makes obedience feel like virtue, and makes rebellion feel like guilt. Over time, that mindset doesn't just live in churches or temples. It lives in homes, schools, communities. It becomes normal, expected, invisible. And the hardest chains to break are the ones you can't see. This is why so many people today still hesitate to question religious authority, even when it conflicts with common sense or human decency. They've been told that doubt is dangerous, that questions are signs of weakness, that reason must bow to faith. And that's not a coincidence, that's design. Religions that survive long enough to influence nations don't just survive because of their beauty. They survive because they've become useful to someone in power, someone with a stake in the status quo. And they evolve to protect that stake. In many parts of the world, even now, challenging religion is not just unpopular, it's illegal. You can be jailed, harassed, attacked, even killed for asking the wrong questions. That's not about spiritual truth. That's about control, rigid, enforced, and violent. And those who enforce it rarely live humble lives. They wear gold. They sit in palaces. They speak on behalf of gods they've never seen. And they tell others to be content with less. Religions have helped powerful men shape the world to their liking, then called it sacred. They've declared war and named it holy. They've defended injustice and called it divine will. And every time someone pushed back, they were told to have faith, to be patient, to obey. But there is nothing noble about submission that benefits only those at the top. And there is nothing sacred about systems that punish people for thinking freely. You don't need a God to be good. You don't need a priest to tell you what's right. You don't need to fear eternal punishment to care for others. Morality doesn't come from obedience. It comes from empathy, from reasoning, from shared experience. And when systems use fear to enforce belief, that's not guidance, that's control. So, when you look at religion, not just as a personal belief, but as an institution, ask who built it, ask who funded it, ask who kept it in place, ask who benefits from it now. Because the answers are usually not the poor, the weak, or the outcast. They're the ones who were told to wait, to serve, to sacrifice. Religions were made by men, and not just any men, powerful men. Men who understood that the greatest control doesn't come from chains or armies. It comes from belief, from shaping the way people see the world, and convincing them that obedience is their purpose. That's not divinity, that's strategy. And when you begin to see that clearly, when you recognize how systems of faith have been designed and protected by those in power, then belief loses its grip. Not because the questions of life become less important, but because you no longer need someone else's answers forced on you. The truth is, you don't have to live inside someone else's system. You don't have to carry the weight of rules made to keep others on top. You don't have to treat ancient power plays as eternal wisdom. You can choose to think, to question, to speak, to live freely. And that freedom, once you taste it, makes the old control fall apart. If you found this video thought-provoking, make sure to subscribe. We're building a space for voices that ask the hard questions and don't settle for silence. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. And if you've ever asked yourself who really benefits from the beliefs we're told never to question, more honest conversations are coming. Stay curious, stay awake,